Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I think there are some extra chairs coming, but maybe we'll get started in the meantime. My name's Arielle. I'm doing a PhD at the university and have been doing this project with the Working Class Movement Library called the People's Papers, looking at 1970s Manchester through the lens of kind of these, especially community newspapers, but lots of different kind of alternative press that is in their collection. So yeah, thanks so much for coming. I don't know, you want to say anything about the Working Class Movement Library?
Correctly. Hi everyone, my name is Nathan. I'm a member of staff at the Working Class Movement Library. So for those of you who don't know, we're based in Salford, opposite Salford University, and our collection covers the last 200 years of predominantly British and Irish working class history. And within that, it contains everything from trade unionism, anti-imperialism, suffragettes, women's liberation, and also what Arielle has recently done a really good job of uncovering is alternative press and anti-establishment press from 60s, 70s and 80s. So yeah, massive props to Arielle for doing this work. It's a really fantastic project. And yeah, great to see you all here this evening. If you want to know a bit more about the Working Class Movement Library, just have a word with me after the event.
And we're also hosted in the Manchester Histories Hub, as you can probably see here. So they're also another resource for kind of community history. So I don't know if you've been connected, but worth looking and getting involved. They have, also I think a Manchester Histories Festival every year too. So so I can give you a little kind of recap of my research and what I've been working on and looking at so far this past summer. And then, there's people with some really amazing personal history here in the room. So the idea for this event is really to get people together to share memories and also share kind of what they were involved with, share different projects, and hopefully kind of have see how these things, see how they connect, make sure that they're not forgotten. And we have some examples on the table, so hoping it can be quite participatory, and we'll have some different speakers sharing about particular papers and projects, but then opening it up hopefully to more of a discussion with you all. So if you need any more refreshments or if you need anything, feel free to help yourself. It's not so formal. So I'll get us started with the first kind of introduction to the research and kind of a little sneak peek into the archives, hopefully get you excited to do more archival research, which is what I'm very excited about. So just to get started, a little bit about me. So I'm from the US originally. I'm doing my PhD at the university, and it's looking at the 1970s in New York City and London, actually, for my focus. So it's looking at social movement archives, and I had a very big focus, but I was interested in kind of urban histories, social movement materials from this time period. That's not supposed to happen.
Maybe shorten the ears.
I think maybe I jostled it.
We'll just unplug them.
I think I maybe just hit it with my leg.
I think sometimes to be set, you have to unplug it all.
Just this.
Yep.
Okay. So in this, it's kind of broad focus of both cities and kind of understanding how they're being contested in this moment. It's kind of like early neoliberal restructuring is happening. So it's a big moment of change. And there's really, I think, an amazing kind of social movement history of how these things were being understood and analyzed and contested in the moment. And I got particularly very excited about these kind of the particular types of materials, kind of these neighborhood-based or city-based publications around different themes, but kind of very much capturing this kind of moment and this urban history in particular. So kind of alternative projects, influence of countercultural politics as well, but then also very rooted in kind of people's everyday lives as well. So from this, I got particularly interested and excited in these community newspapers. And because I'm based in Manchester, I was like, actually, it would be really nice if I could do a little side project. It's not related to my PhD, but maybe I can do some more archival research, which is what I'm most excited about. So I partnered with the Working Class Movement Library and got to do this little placement this summer. And the theme that I really wanted to look at was, in particular, kind of exploring Manchester's kind of alternative press and community papers of the 1970s. And there's a lot in the archive, but kind of I don't think it's often well known, or kind of people don't necessarily see it all together. And I know some of the papers, like the more kind of countercultural ones, have gotten recent attention, but I really wanted to see and show how much there was. And so for the project, this was the premise. It was called the People's Papers, Exploring Greater Manchester's, this kind of blurry term of activist neighborhood newspapers. Sometimes I call it alternative papers, sometimes it's community papers. It's a bit ambiguous. But the idea was to focus on what these publications, as they're connected to kind of these like urban histories. And in the process, kind of also highlighting the archives, which I think often people don't maybe get overlooked. So for this project, we wanted to do, and thinking about how so many of these materials aren't online. So for a younger generation, if they kind of Google search something, it just won't be present. So part of this project is to kind of make things more accessible to people. So we were doing some digitization, we do blog posts, we have events like this one. And I've also been doing an Instagram account, so posting updates about either from interviews or from materials. And so the process is also to kind of highlight the research as it's ongoing, to make it kind of more open. And so for part of that, for me, has been also kind of making this process a part of the project. So in kind of assessing this period, and like, how do you even know what is there if you don't know where to start, basically? So there was a couple big names, but I think what was very cool and exciting for me was to kind of go back to some of these alternative directories, and they're kind of an amazing treasure trove of archival research. So this involved some of these kind of alternative information directories, some of these kind of more like, here's the other news, more focused on alternative publishing. There's like very in-depth directories as part of this Harvester Press, and these are covering basically much broader than Manchester, but often we'll have a Manchester section. And then also it was really nice to come across Imprinting the Sticks, which we will hear more about. But this was a book that was made in the 90s, but talking about a lot of these papers as well. And it was, we happened to connect through online, and I learned about this, but it was also in the Working Class Movement Library collection. So that was a nice, and we'll hear more from Bob about that. So for me, part of this was kind of just like how to get a sense, like a catalog, basically, like see all of these different names, put them all together in one place, which is quite basic, but it felt like it actually was good to do, to see them all together as like a project and see how they might connect. And so part of that also was highlighting kind of the visuals. So even giving people a sense of like, what do things look like? What is in the archive? And again, so much of this isn't online. And so even now, just having these things out there, hopefully it might encourage more research into these. And my disclaimer in my archive research is that this kind of focus is it's kind of ambiguous, really. Like I'm trying to highlight something from these materials, but really there's so many more types of materials in the archive. So just to say, there's things like worker periodicals that were really amazing to come across. There's things like housing periodicals, amazing things like there's different newsletters. We have the Manchester Area Research Centre. We have the Shanti Third World Centre, which we'll hear more about hopefully tonight, who had drum. So and all of this, much of this is from the 1970s, but then obviously into the 80s, it also is so things like Octopus is into the 80s. We have the South Manchester Anti-Racist, Anti-Fascist paper into the 80s. So there's so much more that is beyond the scope. And some of this I kind of tried to include in little ways, but the archives have so much more to keep researching. And I think obviously many people in the room have experience here too, so I think maybe we can get in a little bit more to that broader context as well. As part of this project, it was also interested in kind of the archiving process and how people are archiving these materials, and how, and it's often people who still have their own personal papers. So it's like, how do these things not kind of get lost in people's attics? So for this event, we had an online one. It was hearing from people in Leeds and Liverpool and Birmingham. And so kind of bringing people together who both often had personal experience, but then are also continuing to try to activate the archive in some way or preserve these papers in some way. So we had really great discussion. We had Leeds' other paper here, and we had a project that's doing a lot around the regional press. So, and that's online if people are interested. We also, yeah, it was so nice to get to meet people who were active at the time and to hear firsthand about the materials. And often this was, I would just find something randomly in the archive and you don't have so much context about it. So getting to actually hear from people who have the lived experience kind of make the archives come alive. So for me, we did interviews, and then we've also been doing these kind of like paper profiles to just kind of get a sense of what do the materials look like? What kinds of things do they have? And hopefully getting people excited about going through the archives themselves. Part of this also was, these are texts from those directories that I mentioned. And so kind of seeing how much you can kind of learn about the materials from basically what's quite limited. Like you have the materials themselves and you have these directories. What can you learn about these papers? And it's actually quite a good starting point, I think. So for me, this is kind of my starting point. And then obviously, hopefully the discussion can go a lot more into more depth around what were these materials actually like in person. But one thing that I was particularly struck by when going through these was there's lots of different aesthetics that are very interesting and kind of quirky things. So you have, you can have a little poem from Thatcher, which is obviously making fun of Thatcher. You can have kind of graphics making political commentary. It's also important to see where things are printed. So this one's Moss Side Press, which is obviously will be a recurring theme. And then the thing that I think for me that really highlights one of the values that I find from this type of materials in the context of urban history is the papers will often have kind of local directories of things that are happening. And for me, this is just an amazing snapshot of Manchester at a particular moment. And you're like, what were the kind of like political things happening at this time? And in a broad sense, political in the kind of like everyday. And you can just see, even like looking at these headers, you're like, wow, there's so much happening here. And for me, this is part of that question of like, how are these things remembered? Do people know that all of these things were happening in Manchester in the 70s? Across, you have Science for People group, you have people organizing around kind of one-parent families, you have prisoners, you have like various mental patients. You have like, it covers such a broad category of things. And I don't know if people maybe understand that. Maybe certain highlights get remembered in certain ways, but I'm just like the kind of breadth of what was happening at this time. And the other thing for me that I'm particularly interested in for this like urban history context is to think about all these kind of places that were kind of central to how these papers were either distributed or also kind of a part of. And often in these paper directories, they'll include things like a community action and resource list. So you'll have things like Manchester Area Resource Centre, you have Waterloo Place Community Project, which there has a great flyer for. And part of this, again, there's like directories of cooperative projects that are happening. And so even just like starting to scratch the surface, you're like, wow, there's so many things here that actually deserve much more attention, I would say, in terms of, are these things remembered, or how are they remembered? Grassroots Books, for example, now has their archive at the library, which is really exciting, and maybe Maggie can mention that. But yeah, there's so much here, I think. So yeah, I guess in that context, maybe I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll go a bit more into paper profile. So yeah, Bob will have a little bit more of this like actual context for the papers. We're gonna have transition here. Oh.
Yeah, that's fine. How do I show them?
Do you want to sit here? We can trade spots. Isn't that, yeah, it's not the most glamorous spot here. Sorry, I have all my things.
You ready?
That's very exciting. Okay. And I can hold.
Please, Christmas break date. It's spot.
I hate that new sign.
What do I press?
I think it's
That one.
the arrows. Does that work? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Bob Dickinson, and when I was 15 in 1970, I made an underground magazine at school about my school. I didn't live in Manchester at the time. I lived in a place called Sandbach, which is on the M6 near Crewe. I didn't like my school, and the reason I decided to do this underground magazine was because I'd been to Manchester and I'd seen my first rock gig at the Free Trade Hall. And I went to see a band called Taste. I don't know if anybody remembers them. They came from Ireland. They were a three-piece blues band. Rory Gallagher played the lead guitar. It was really good. But before the gig, I went through the doors into the foyer of the Free Trade Hall, and I saw this guy. And he's standing in the foyer. He's got long black hair, big black beard, a bit of a wild expression. And his table, he had a table in front of him that was kind of on the verge of collapse because it was just covered with underground publications. And I started looking at them, and these were the sort of thing I saw, you know, the famous underground papers like Oz and International Times, which were distributed nationally, but also he had local ones as well. And I got really interested in this, and I only had a limited amount of money, but I bought a copy of Oz, and it was Oz. It wasn't that Oz. It was Oz 29 a bit later on, which was a women's liberation issue actually, and I went back home and I got together with some mates, and we produced our underground paper, and we used a machine like this, a Gestetner machine. Those of you who know what a Gestetner machine does, it is a very messy process where you have to turn the crank of, you bake a stencil basically. You can draw on the stencil, you can type on the stencil, and then you attach the stencil to a kind of drum which contains ink. You turn the handle and it churns out copies. And it's a very simple way of doing things. And Gestetners were invented, I think, in the late 19th century. It's amazing to think that they've got such a history. But that's what we used. Now, a bit later on, about in the 1990s, I wrote a book about the history of the alternative press in Manchester because of what subsequently happened to me and the magazines I wrote for. So I knew quite a lot of people who were still around, and I did an MPhil at Manchester Polytechnic or Manchester Metropolitan University, and it was published as Imprinting the Sticks in 1997, and it features a family tree of the Manchester alternative press. And I've done some copies, so you can pick one up if you would like to take one away. It's not an exhaustive family tree. There's things that might not be there, but at the time, that's all I knew about. That's all I was aware of at the time I was doing my thesis, and I only had a limited amount of time to do the thesis. So one of the alternative magazines or underground papers that I found out about was on that I knew people who'd worked on, and I'd bought it myself at times, was Grass Eye. And this is a Grass Eye advert for a benefit, for a rock benefit with, you can see the names of the bands, Edgar Borton Band, Principal Edwards Magic Theatre, Barclay James Harvest, etc., etc. And this is one of the main ways in which the sort of magazines that I worked for brought in some extra cash. Was you put a gig on with some bands, and hopefully you did make a bit of extra cash. And that kind of practice went on for right the way through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when I actually was working on the post-punk fanzine. One of the longest-lasting underground, later alternative, I suppose you'd say, magazines in Manchester was Mole Express. The guy who I saw in the foyer of the Free Trade Hall that day in 1970 was Mike Don, the late Mike Don, who kept Mole Express going for absolutely years, and I got to know him quite well. And he's interviewed in the book. He was a really, really great guy, and he just had this kind of absolute refusal to give up. You know, he just kept working on projects like Mole Express and City Inquirer later on, which were really seriously investigative underground papers and alternative papers. He exposed some really interesting scandals, and it was just his complete doggedness that kept him going, I think. So, thank you. I also found out about the regional, within the Greater Manchester region, there began to be more community papers and regional, sub-regional magazines, notably RAP, Rochdale Alternative Press. I've got Salford Star up there, which was much later on, but it was running for quite a long time, Salford Star. But RAP was a seriously important publication, not just because it was running for years, but also because they set up their own printing facility, like Moss Side Press as well. Owning the means of production or controlling the means of production was really important for alternative papers, because printers could refuse to work with you if they thought they were going to get sued by somebody. It was quite brave of a company like RAP or Moss Side Press to actually keep publishing alternative magazines and newspapers. The other thing about RAP was, and Moss Side Press, were they employed people, they created jobs, so they became a business, and they kind of had to keep going, and that's really why they were also very important. Another publication that I found, I didn't find it in 1970 because it didn't start here till 72, was Catonsville Roadrunner, which was a radical Christian underground paper. I found out about it actually because I became a Quaker in the early 70s, and I was in a Quaker meeting in Wilmslow one Sunday, and I don't know if you know what a Quaker meeting's like. It's like everybody sits in silence, looks at each other. Sometimes somebody will stand up and say something, and that will kind of change the group dynamic. So this young woman, who's a couple of years older than me, stood up and held up a copy of Catonsville Roadrunner, and she said, "I think, friends, you may be interested in this publication. It's a pacifist, radical Catholic, radical Christian alternative paper, and it's being published in Manchester." And we all got to look at it afterwards, and that sort of stuck in my memory. Catonsville Roadrunner was named after an event in the United States during the Vietnam War, obviously, when a group of radical Catholic priests broke into a draft card center in Catonsville and burned the draft cards so that they couldn't get sent out to young men who had to be sent off to fight in Vietnam. And those radical priests had to go underground. They had to go into hiding. So when I found out, about that, I realized that that word underground didn't just mean alternative. It meant seriously keeping secret about something, keeping out of the way of the authorities. In 1977, I moved to Manchester full time, and I worked. I wrote for the New Manchester Review, which was a long-running alternative events magazine that was based in Waterloo Place, and I've heard the phrase Waterloo Place echoing around among you all this evening. It's an important location, And the review was at 182 Oxford Road in Waterloo Place, upstairs from McGill's bookshop, which is where, by 1977, Mike Don had a little office where he was doing City Inquirer, I think, by that time. The review was based on Time Out, but wasn't Time Out. There had been a version of Time Out that Tony Elliott, who'd established Time Out in London, had tried to run, but it had failed. So, and there had been a couple of attempts to run a sort of fortnightly events magazine. Well, the review ran from 1974 to 1980, 81, I think, and it contained, as well as listings, it contained news reports and general arts interviews and stuff about rock and cinema and theatre and so on. And quite a few sort of notable writers came through that publication. But when the review went bust, which inevitably it had to, after Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, you found that the kind of readers that would buy a fortnightly magazine just didn't want to buy a fortnightly events magazine anymore. Lots of places closed down, unemployment went rocketing. And there was an attempt to start this magazine, the Manchester Flash, which failed dramatically, and it cost a lot of money. A lot of money disappeared as a result. So what happened to me was I started writing for the what punk or post-punk fanzines, and there were several that had started in Manchester a bit earlier on. Gassed Up on the left was run by Mick Middles. Shy Talk was run by, or edited by a guy called Steve Shy. Plaything on the right, you can see his signature at the bottom, was a short-lived fanzine by Pete Shelley of the Buzzcocks. And there was this one which was called Girl Trouble, which was Paul Morley's first attempt at publishing anything. And he later went on to the New Manchester Review, and then he went to work for the NME in the New Musical Express in London. And this was the one I ended up writing for, City Fun. City Fun started in the late 70s, and I think it started about 1978. And around about 1980, it ceased publication temporarily, and then it relaunched, and it tried to be better designed, and it tried to be a bit more in-depth. And we kept it running for a couple of years from, and this is another subject that needs to be talked about, which is where do you work from? What kind of facilities have you got? How do you find somewhere cheap to base yourselves? The New Manchester Review was based in a building that was owned by the university, and I think we got it rent-free. City Fun ended up in an office that was given to us rent-free, again, by The Fall, the band The Fall, who had their rehearsal rooms upstairs. It was in Higher Broughton, Bury New Road. And so we heard The Fall a lot, rehearsing, obviously. And downstairs there was a curry house, so we smelt a lot of curry. But we didn't get to eat anything because we were all broke. But it was really interesting experience in some ways. Very straightening, I think is the word. I was in touch with, and I knew the people behind the Manchester Women's paper. In the book, I do touch on the women's press and women's liberation newsletter and so on. And it's in the family tree as well, although I'm sure you're going to find faults with the family tree, but it is referred to. Later on, of course, there was a much more serious attempt to run a fortnightly What's On or events magazine, and that was City Life, which was based to a certain extent on New Manchester Review. But as you can see from those two front covers, it was strongly reliant on the fact that there was a musical renaissance going on in Manchester, thanks to things like Factory Records and the Hacienda. I wrote a lot for them as well, and it went on for quite a long time, City Life, until it ran up against its nemesis, which was not just sort of the financial problem of keeping a fortnightly magazine running and paying some people, but not all people, to work for it. The main other problem was the Manchester Evening News, which was always your enemy. You wanted to replace the Evening News. You wanted to make them realise that you were doing something a bit more in touch with something that was really important that was going on. But inevitably, the Evening News kept going, and what happened to City Life was they basically took over the name City Life, and it just got swallowed by them. These were a couple of other publications that I had dealings with during the period when I was researching the book. And remember, I was doing the book, or doing the thesis, in the mid-1990s. Bop City was a music-related fanzine which gave away a cassette tape with every issue, run by Sarah Champion. Bad Press was a really interesting investigative free sheet that was done by a guy called Andrew Orlovsky, who went on to do some really interesting satirical political work. All he did, he used to write this thing, and then he used to give it away to people in the queue to the Hacienda, standing outside the Hacienda, just giving them out. And if you don't want to end up looking like this guy here, then don't work for the alternative press. That's me asleep on a bench in Sheffield railway station on the way back from a gig in Leicester where we interviewed the Clash. But there was a complete mess up with transport, and we got stuck in Sheffield all night, and that's what happened to me. And that concludes my address. Thank you for listening.
And we do have some materials that might overlap with a few of the things that you mentioned. So maybe at the end, if anyone gets a chance, we have a table full of things to look through. We have a couple other examples too. So Maggie, don't you want to come up and share from Long Sight? I have...
You've got pictures.
Yeah, and I have actually an issue, so maybe... is that somewhere? Sorry.
So,
Here.
South stuff.
Yeah, in the meantime, get started.
So now we're going back to I think, activist neighbourhood papers, you called it, which I thought was actually a very good description. So Longside News, as it's small parts of Manchester, but had its own newsletter. There's a few people here actually who were involved. Like one who was willing to stand up at the front here. We think it ran from bi-monthly from 74 to 78, and then a few odd issues. It didn't keep up the regularity, but there were some later issues because one's here from 1980. So it was local people who were involved in other campaigns and community action. So it was was activist neighbourhood paper in that sense, because it was a part of how you were arguing your case, recruiting people to help, and so on. It had, as far as I know, nobody was a journalist or interested in being a journalist or interested or writing for anything else. It was, it was about the campaign. That's why we were doing it. It's sold, we can see from the covers that we've got, for 4p, and rising to 5p, and that 1981 was 10p, and it was an A4 printed, and we were just talking earlier, somehow, but I've no idea how, we had the money because it was printed by some press in New Mills or somewhere, so somebody friendly, must have been friendly to us, but presumably we paid them for it. We had very few small ads. There were one or two where, a newsagent says, please come to us, that sort of thing. I assumed that we took some money off them to put that sort of thing in.
Maggie, we also sold them.
For
People.
yeah, for
Door to door.
doors, yeah, taking them
My
around.
main role.
Well, thank you, Barry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, and we ask people 20p for 5 issues, and we'll put them through your door. Yeah, that sort of thing. So, yeah, it was talking to people, getting the newspaper, what were the issues, that sort of thing.
Oh, how?
So some of the things going on. So it covered, from my memory, the core group for Longsight News came from a very small part of Longsight, we call the Hambleton Road area, but it covered the wider Longsight ward or area. So there was a council estate, the Anson estate, and there were the new council houses that were built. I mean, you can still see it now. There'd been the slum clearance, had got rid of the houses. They'd built new houses all out along Stockport Road. And there's another story in it as to why the houses that exist around the Hamilton Road area weren't demolished. And of course, 50, 60, however many years later are still there. We were told they didn't have a 20-year life in them. So it covered both uncontentious things like trips to Blackpool and trip to Dinting, play schemes, but it also local campaigns. One issue here is about the Longsight District Centre Action Group, who are opposed to the road proposals when the Longsight District Centre in Asda were being developed, and a campaign to keep the local public laundry open. Most of you won't know about public laundries, but the campaign by the Longsight Tenants Association, those new houses that had been built had a new heating system with these glorious meters that made you pay for your neighbour's heating. And so there was a big campaign on that, which Longsight News was involved with. We had support for squatters, fuel poverty issues, and reports on public meetings. A public meeting about the Longsight District Centre had 350 people attending, we report. So it's that neighbourhood activism that it records, which, going back to Arielle's point of people want to find out about that, looking through these newspapers. I think I told you, Alex, I was going to say this. It took on the local council quite a lot, also took on the police. And there was one particular local policeman who I've just put here, who interviewed minors without their parents present. A bit more than that, of course. And so the paper and Alex was sued for libel. And we had a Longsight News defence group, that's which, again, Bob mentioned that that was one of the risks for people who printed for us, and why we often needed to print our own. When we had the defence group, we used the address and phone number of Grassroots Books, which, again, those of you of my generation know was the alternative radical bookshop in Manchester. And Arielle asked me to just mention that. So some of us who were involved in Grassroots Books spent some time in the last few years trying to pull together an archive. We have nothing, we hadn't got the accounts, we hadn't got the stock list, we hadn't got, we got next to nothing. But we interviewed people, and we did pull some things out of the woodwork, and we deposited that here at Manchester Central Library. I don't think it's sort of catalogued and online yet, but if you needed it, ask for it because we have now deposited it. So in terms of, but going back to Longsight News, it was just a part of the many things, as I say. It wasn't that we were into having a newspaper. It was what we needed to do to get the message out, to recruit people in, to tell people what we were doing. And but there's lots of things I don't know about it. I don't know how many we printed. I don't know where the money came from to print it. But we did it, and for those 4 years and then sometime afterwards, there is, I'm pretty sure there's a full set here already at the Central Library. We're going to check. And there's some working class movement library. And then we found some in our cupboards, which will also probably go to the working class movement library.
Yeah, and there's some on the table.
But they're on the table to look at.
And just to say, I'm kind of been hopefully not making you all dizzy by moving around the page, but just pulled up like one issue at random, and I think it kind of maybe helps show these things that you're talking about. It's about all kinds of everyday life, really.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that, it's so rich in terms of these neighborhood details. So you have things like the trips, the playhouse, you have things like the meters, but you also have just like these fun craft projects. You have the Longsight Community Festival, you have the program of events, you have what's happening at the neighborhood center. And so I think it does kind of capture this like rich world of this particular moment in a way that I find super interesting. And you have, different sections and themes. It's super interesting that you have like a local history section, and like that's such a lovely feature to get through, to look through. And then you also have the Birch House Co-op, so you have updates on kind of housing co-op stuff that, again, continues in a different form today. And then again, just seeing like how there's a children's page and how there's, you can have on one hand like all of the issues of the planning department, and then on the other hand like the maze of the children's MAC. And I feel like that that mix of different types of content and different people that it's reaching in this particular way, I think is really something that I've like loved going to see through the archives and get to see like little pictures or kind of news. And again, you have this section where it's like this kind of what's on, so you get to see what kind of meetings people were having, things on the Playhouse, different updates, the news where it's sold. So for me, this is like I think like a really interesting kind of snapshot into a particular moment, a particular place, and what's happening at that time.
And the Playhouse and Neighbourhood Centre on Hamilton Road, you talk about getting buildings for free. Well, they were squatted buildings.
Right.
Yeah, that's how we have places to work. Yeah.
I'm wondering, but Barry might know, is where did the money come from? So the neighbourhood centre got some money by selling furniture, didn't it? And whether all the money out of her windows, there's so many different activities. Oh yeah, second-hand shop,
We did do a second-hand shop, so it may we've raised it.
I think all the money went to all these different projects, kind of the same people. Yeah, I think these just neither popped. So so when the house being demolished, there was furniture going.
I mean,
It's the van. There was a van got hired out as well. So
whole economy. But I think it's also interesting. A number of people I've talked to said that either housing could be squatted or was very cheap and could be shared with other people, and that often you didn't have to work a full-time job. You could have benefits, or you could have other ways of living cheaply, basically. So
They were houses that were due to be demolished. So it's a particular sort of squatting.
yeah.
And they were eventually demolished.
Well, some were.
I know, but where the ones that... There was the neighbourhood centre, there was a playhouse, there was a group of women who were doing puppetry in another house that was squatting. We tried to occupy all these houses that the council was leaving empty to demolish.
do you want to? I also have Link Up as another example. Would you like to share, Barry? Anything about this one?
Well, I haven't got any... Oh,
I just have it on the background here. And if you want to talk into this, we're trying to record sound.
okay.
If it works.
You want me to hold it?
Just hold it. I should
Well, Link Up was an alternative information magazine, which I think it started at Waterloo Place, which has been mentioned before. There was a project right at the top of the building called the Attic Library, which was like an alternative library. And I think Link Up started there. And it was 6p then. It was different, didn't cost very much. Different groups of people were involved in producing it. It started off on a Gestetner type machine. I think this is an example. I drew this on a stencil. And then there was another bit of technology, I don't know whether people are interested in this, where you could cut a stencil in a machine. So you would draw it up on paper, a bit like a photocopy machine, but it produced a stencil that went onto a Gestetner machine. In later years, it was produced on offset litho printing in Longsight Library. There was a community resource centre, which when I was looking for some things today, some copies of this, I found a whole load of stuff about the community resource centre in Longsight Library. So it was produced there. Different groups of people, and eventually it was produced in my house after. I don't know what happened to Waterloo Place, why the things closed down. That was a squat as well. There was a load of projects, and Colin was involved in Shanty Turboil Centre on the ground floor. Then there was a cafe called Grapevine on the first floor, and the Attic Library on the second floor. And in the basement, there were various things. There was a...
Well, this is also maybe a bit... Well, Paul couldn't be here today, but he did have a video, and it's not... I don't think it's playing, but it is online if anyone wants to see it. But he was talking about Mancunian Gay and also the Lesbian Express. And these were copies that he shared because Mancunian Gay, and I think, grew out of the gay men's centre, the gay centre that was also at Waterloo Place, and they had a switchboard, and then also produced Mancunian Gay. So yeah, these were two examples he shares, and he talks a little bit about how he was involved. But yeah, this one's online now, if anyone does want to see it. But yeah, I guess this would also be an opportunity to open it up for people. I know there's people who have other experiences of papers too. So if there's anything that people wanted to share about other projects or papers they were connected to, that would be great. And I can give you, we're trying to record the audio too, so this is our pretend microphone.
Yeah, I was involved in a paper that's not in the geographic area, in Calder Valley Press, not too far away. But it was kind of, I think, when I think about the experience of producing these kind of community papers, one of the things was how do you measure the engagement of the community with the publication? And I think there's a number of ways that, because of course none of us were doing evaluation or anything like that, but one is how much you got unsolicited offers of information. That was quite a good measure of how much you were reaching beyond your own groups of people. The other is the letters page. I noticed there is a letters page in the Longsight News. Certainly, it would be difficult to do a real examination of letters pages. I know that in ours, we wrote half the letters ourselves. You know? And the other was that other feedback that you get, which was being sued, or we were never sued. We did have the special branch approached the local newspaper, the Hebden Bridge Times, journalists, asking who we were, because our names were never in the paper. To their credit, they never fessed up who people were. But again, that was another potential measure of how much anyone was noticing beyond our own audience that we existed.
Thanks. Just on how things were paid for, and this is towards the end of the period, there's a wonderful scam called the Enterprise Allowance. And I mean, people remember this. Basically, you went to the job centre and said, Maggie has shown me the light. I am a young entrepreneur and I'm going to sell ice cream. You took that, and they gave you more money than Dole. And then you scuttled out, did whatever you were up to do, never told them. And they never chased you. There was no testing, no visits, nothing. And, you know, I think they think a lot of ice cream was made in Manchester.
Most rock bands started that way. Yeah, right.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, go on. I'll come up to the front.
Okay, yeah.
I'll try not to take too long up there. Thank you. Whoop, there you go. Right, my name's Bob Jones. I had the fortune to, great to see you all, by the way. Normally, I meet up with old faces at funerals, so great, you're all alive, okay. And now I'm just about alive. Shall I hold that?
It's kind of fine.
Which way around? That way around?
Yes.
Yeah, I worked at Moss Press because I used to write little articles for Mole Express. I used to come down to Manchester from Royton. I went to art college in Rochdale. We had our own little thing up there called Madcap. Only a few issues duplicated. And that was scurrilous and libelous. We never got caught because there weren't enough issues. But there's a fellow called Barry Fitton who had a little shop. He was a poet. I used to play guitar at his jazz and poetry events. And Barry was very important because he was the guy that went to Rochdale Alternative Press, which Moss Side Press used to print before they got their own press. He was the guy who alleged, quite truthfully, that Cyril Smith, the Liberal MP, was at it in this was it a remand place? What was it actually called, the place? He abused kids. He abused boys. And Barry was one of them.
Didn't he? He liked spanking them.
Yes, yeah. And Rochdale Alternative Press printed this, and he never sued. Private Eye took up the story. This is when they were their own press. We didn't print it on Moss Side Press. I think they printed it themselves. And that was a big story, and it went on for years. And like I say, he never sued because it was true. And Barry continued, and eventually I think it was TV documentaries made about it. So that was the power of having a facility like RAP. I was hoping one of them might have been here tonight. Mole Express, I say I was living in Royton. I went down to London, so there was a thing called BIT, and the idea that information is power, which obviously it is. They were a bit like that guide of, you could find anything out. It was a fairly comprehensive. But there's a phone line and a publication. When I moved back up here from London, having bought Grass Eye much earlier, that was the first outcome, used to seem like Don around with his newspaper bag that needed a good wash. See him at gigs, Roger Eagle's place, the Magic Village. He would be selling stuff there. You'd see him all over the show. I'm rambling a bit. Distribution was a problem for all these kind of papers. Grassroots was essential when they were up Brook Street and then when they were at Newton Street, because you could find all sorts of stuff. I used to get the Wobblies magazine from the States, International Workers of the World. You could buy stuff like that, which is remarkable. But you wouldn't get that in W.H. Smith's. But going back to the press, Moss Side Press was set up by the student Christian movement people, Robbie Duncan, Helen Duncan, Roger Jackson, who was involved with Moss Side News, I think, before Moss Side Press was established. They moved into, having got some finance, I'm not sure where from, but they moved into the basement of the Nello James Centre, which was originally the Walton Cottage. The Walton Cottage Trust is still going. That is a story in itself, the history of the Nello James Centre.
There's been a recent documentary, actually. There's been a recent documentary about the Nello James Center.
It's a scandal. It's still ongoing, that story. Anyway, so they're in the basement. I'm writing stuff for Moa Express with other people like Michael Rowe here, lots of different contributors. It's pretty blokey. I think later on there was more women contributors. In fact, there's a lovely paragraph on the Women's Press there that Moss Side Press printed, having printed both magazines, criticising a cartoon or an illustration that was in Mole Express that was sexist. So I recommend you have a look at that. I read it out, it's a bit long. There were conflicts. Vanessa Redgrave paid for the Nello James Centre to be established. She was a candidate for the Workers' Revolutionary Party at one point, stood in Moss Side. And so she was the benefactor. Upstairs was Neil Pearson Nursery. There is a documentary, it might be the same one you're referring to, about, which was lost. It was made in, I think, early 80s, and then rediscovered recently. You would know, Marion, about that, but that's a separate thing. So anyway, we printed all this stuff. We didn't print anything from, like, Socialist Worker Party. They had their own press. Political parties like that we avoided. You just get into arguments with them. They let them get on with it. There were so many acronyms in Wally Range at that time. The RCG, the WRP, there's the other. Socialist Worker did a lot of good work with anti-Nazism, the rallies and the concerts. But any local tenants group or organisation, grassroots group, they would try and take it over and direct it, the old Trotskyist thing. So we wouldn't have out to do with them. But tenants groups, I remember the campaign for rehousing from Gretney Walk, Limbeck, the walk-up flats in Hume and in Moss Side. People, tenants would put themselves up for election against the councillors. So we would print their stuff. Even if they were standing for the Liberal Party, if it was a genuine, as you know, Tom Murphy, he got a lot of votes. I think we printed stuff for him because we knew him. It wasn't so much the Liberal Party that he was representing. It made sense for him to stand under the Liberal Party banner. We did get sued. It was my fault, Mole Express. I won't take too long, but a guy called Nigel Lay, strange character, came to us, and he alleged that the Central Detention Centre, where you would get held overnight if you had alleged criminality, would give you a solicitor, but off a short list. So you could, if you had a solicitor, you already knew a solicitor, you could bring them. But they had a list of 3 that were favoured, and Nigel said, "This is unfair." He wasn't a solicitor, he was a muckraker, which suited us. So we believed him. And we went to Campbell Malone, quite a famous lawyer in the end. And his, I can't remember his name, the guy I worked with in Salford. We said, is this true? That there's favouritism? And he said, probably yes. So we published it. There's a firm called Pennoni, criminal defence lawyers. They've worked with some big crims. And we said they were involved. A guy called, what was his first name? Lapidus, who was a one-man show solicitor in Prestwich, and another firm. I can't off the top of my head remember it now. So we said, these firms are getting the bulk of the work. It's not fair on all the solicitors who are, just as valuable to the community. And of course, we couldn't prove it. Nigel buggered off. Campbell couldn't really stick his head above water and say, yes, it's all true, because he's in the business. Long story short, we went to court and Campbell advised us. I found all the documentation the other night. We said, yes, fair enough, you're right. We maligned you. We had to pay 100 quid for an apology in the Evening News. So we hereby acknowledge that we were, maligning your good reputations. I can't remember the wording. And we thought, well, we had put a benefit on. Me and a Dutch guy, Jan, got a room above the Claremont in Moss Side, and we had a dance and raised the money for that. Mike Don was not happy. Right. And we thought that was that. Great. But then a few months later, I'd moved house. I was living in the Crescents. And apparently I'd missed a court appearance. He'd re-sued us. He'd sued me, Moss Side Press, Bowl Express, and Campbell Malone, which is, ludicrous. And I didn't get the past judgment against me without me knowing. So I had to go and apply to have all that turned over. Luckily, Lapidus, this is just Lapidus on his own. It got moved to Bury because for some reason they thought, the Manchester judges might be influenced. Lapidus was based in Prestwich, which is nearer to Bury than Manchester. So I go up there, he doesn't turn up. So I got costs for the appearance and a new date. He didn't turn up to that either. So I got costs again. Right. I think that's enough about the legal side, but Mike wasn't very happy. I think they got done again later on for something, but I think I'd left by then. We trained up Lucia Fitzgerald and Auntie Cooper. As I'd been trained up, I got told if you learn how to print, and we won't charge you labour for doing mould. So I learned how to do offset litho. Look up when you get a chance, rotor print. And did we find everything on a letter set? Letter set was a godsend. For those of you who don't know, there we go. You got a sheet of plastic with individual letters or punctuation marks, and you rubbed this plastic and the letter came off onto the paper. Right? Hard to imagine in this digital age. Right? As there are lots of things. So most of those magazines.
There's an amazing influence of letterhead on headlining community papers, because if you'd run out of F's,
you could change them.
Another word.
W's and M's you could reverse round. Very flexible.
Another event about printing.
Yeah. But rotor print.
Rodeo yet?
We haven't mentioned rodeo, no. But yeah, the rotor print was essentially, we had it was an A3 machine. And offset litho was a revolutionary thing when it came in, because you didn't have to use lots of little pieces of type, which we wouldn't have had all this if we'd not had rotary offset lithos. I think that's probably enough from me. Mike Rowe here, my friend, he was involved in Common Word, which was a writer's thing that was set up by a fellow called Greg Wilkinson, Terry Martin. Yes.
There's a copy at Lifetimes, which is
Yeah.
by Greg Wilkinson.
Yeah.
Happened to be discussing it earlier.
And that, I think that, although it's a very close relative to all these, because it was the idea of working class writers having an outlet, because having a book published, if you were working class, it's impossible. So that started up. I don't know if this time. Do you think Mike should say a few words about that?
Would you like to? Would you like to sit up front or?
Oh yeah,
Whoever is comfortable.
yeah.
Oops. He's Mike's brolly or somebody's brolly.
Man, yeah. early 70s, I was involved in a lot of committees, trade union, arts council, etc., etc. But I wasn't much into politics. I wanted to get into politics, but I knew people in the Labour Party, and no. And the communists, oh dear, so bloody boring. Oh. So I turned up one night, I went to see, what were they called? Josh.
The Fall, probably.
No, heavy metal stuff.
Black Sabbath.
Black Sabbath, yeah. I went to see Black Sabbath at Salford University. And when I got in, there's this chap, beard, long hair, looked really wild man of Borneo type. And he had this portable newsstand that had newspapers on it and magazines. I was looking at it and he said, "What are you looking for?" I said, "Oh, something political, but not Trotskyists." I'd met a couple of Trotskyists and they were bad as well. And he said, "Try this one, you like it." And it was Black and Red Outlook, which was the organ of the anarcho-syndicalists. So I read it, and at the back there was about meetings, and he had Manchester anarchists. I thought I'll give those a go. So I went there and found it really exciting. You know, they were really nice people. And Mike was also there. And not many people knew that Mike was very much an anarchist. He joined the Organisation of Revolutionary Anarchists in the mid-70s. And I'd been a writer for a long time, writing stuff. And I decided with Mike, yeah, I'll have a go at writing, doing a bit of reporting for the Mall Express. That went on for a couple of years. And then when Mo finished, he opened City Inquirer, which was I think 4-sheet, 8-sheet, scandal sheet sort of thing. You know, they just looking at what the dirty doings we're doing in the council, the police, and etc. And that went on, I think, till 1980, and then he finished that. And he went on to something else then, but I lost contact.
Bob would know.
Yeah, was it something about wine?
Dreamberry wine.
Yes, that was it. Yes, but I lost contact with him by then.
This is science fiction.
Science fiction.
Yeah. But he was a great fellow, Mike. Oh, lovely fellow, yeah. And he's got his obituary in The Guardian, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. That was very good.
Just a quick one, when you got that slide up, survived. That's the image.
Yeah.
Why was it NOUL? Was it, he started off as Moo.
Yeah.
Is that a Scottish thing? Because mine was Scots. Does anybody know?
Well, when I think he did start it because he just wanted to do it, and he wanted to spell it.
Name.
The name, yeah. I think the idea was to just spell it wrong.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. That's anarchism for you.
Oh, I was supposed to talk about Common Word, wasn't there?
You were?
Yeah. Oh, I was at the Trades Council meeting one time, and they had reading out the news. They said there's an organisation called Common Word, and they want to do stories of working class people. So I went to that Common Word, and yeah, that was good. And they actually publishing, they had a magazine right on. So I started writing for that. And eventually, when Greg left, I started working there. Before that, I was working in factories and doing trade union work. And I did about 6 months and I got a bit tired. I wanted to get back to the factory and start stirring them all up. But Commonwealth was brilliant, yeah, it was really good. And you got people who'd never been published before, and they were really pleased to see themselves in the magazine, and it was good stuff they were turning out too. Yeah, it's great,
I
Commonwealth.
think they inspired some other places as well. I mean, they're still going, I think. I know Frank Kirshner was involved in this at the same time as you were.
Yeah.
And I heard from her 3 years ago that they had some kind of celebration of Common Word and didn't refer to any of the people who set it up originally, like Craig and and all that. But I think it was always a challenge dealing with grant-aided organisations. I mean, the Film and Video Workshop, which I was involved in as well, that relied on North West Arts, as it then was. Common Word would rely on funding from the council. So all these papers and magazines were independent, that negotiating for grants. I mean, I spent half the time for many years applying for grants. So you 20 applications, you might get one. The best time, Tosh Ryan, who a lot of you may remember, fly posting king, entrepreneur, musician. When I started doing videos, we put in applications for the funding. We did stuff for the City Council via Brian Harrison, the Labour councillor who we got on well with. And when the Greater Manchester Council was abolished, under Maggie's rule, we got thousands of pounds because they were giving money out and there was no Sora, which there wasn't for them. I think we got 18 grand to document the closure of Greater Manchester Council. It was never finished, but we videoed James Anderson. We got access to the police committee. So that whole thing of video and distribution, again, that the problem with the papers had came into play. But it was that little period was a window of opportunity for grabbing loads of money off the state, even though it was Thatcher abolishing these organisations. So it was a useful time. And if you were good, like Tosh was, at swinging things, you could get a bit of moolah out of it,
And one of the projects that we launched at Waterloo Place, to cut a very long story short, was the Third World Centre, as we called it in those days. It went through many iterations from 74 through to around 82. And the theme I would want to bring in is this thing about getting funding, because our little shop that we had, which is actually still there further down Oxford Road as the Oxfam shop. Oxfam basically took it over. But that wasn't enough to pay for staff to do the kind of work that needed doing, because we were trying to be literally a shop window on the whole wide world. I mean, this is really from the micro-local, your local neighborhood center or whatever, up to, this is the planetary picture with campaigns on anti-apartheid, Chile solidarity, human rights in Thailand, the Aborigines. I mean, it was a big geographical scope, and that needed some staff. And I was the full-time worker, but I could see the money, such as it was, running out. We had to find another funding solution. And in the end, through a complicated set of processes, we got money from War on Want, who was in some ways more radical than we were, the most radical of the development agencies, and also money through Judith Hart's Overseas Development Ministry, and then the European Commission in the early Thatcher years when the Labour money was drying up. And we actually managed to create a whole new project around trade union solidarity. And we employed young Stuart here to be the first worker. And then he teamed up. We had a second worker, Dave Spooner, who sadly died earlier this year. Some of you may remember him. And he came out of Big Flame and Sussex University and other connections. We are now trying to write the history of what came out of that Third World Centre, not just the Oxfam shop, but a journal called International Labour Reports, which reported on trade union struggles all around the world, trying to build links between workers in multinational companies at this end and at that end. And of course, in the early 80s, there was a huge collapse of industries. The Thatcherite Reagan idea of free markets, neoliberalism coming in, and all these jobs disappearing to the other end of the earth. So Stuart and Dave and others made connections with people in the Philippines and Hong Kong. It was a very exciting project, and it grew out of this very humble little shop project at Waterloo Place, which is another whole story. Yes, thank you for putting that up. So just to say that there are other kinds of radical activity that are not just neighbourhood and local working class voices. There are other kinds of challenges to the the wretched system we have, and we had certainly in those days. And some of it came from people with other kinds of ideas and found other kinds of ways of continuing the work through funding partnerships. That's a very quick summary. I would like to say more, but I think time is short. Thanks for the opportunity.
And you can go in the back.
Thanks. My name's Caroline Beedale, and I was involved in something called originally Manchester Engineering Research Group, or sometimes known as the Male Engineering Research Group, because I think I was probably one of the few women involved. We later changed it to Manchester Employment Research Group, but we were one of the groups that benefited from having an office above the Oxfam shop. Right. Merg was based in there. We also benefited from getting money from the Manpower Services Commission. Yes. Which was a bit like the enterprise allowance that you mentioned. Yeah. We managed to fund 4 workers, I remember, at one time. And Dave Carter, who was a friend of Dave Spooner's, the 2 Daves were quite well known around. Oh, Dave, I didn't see you. Hello. Well, he was the coordinator for Merg for a while when we were up above the Oxfam shop. So it all links in with, getting that funding. We also got money in 1987, when Greater Manchester Council was abolished, to set up Greater Manchester Hazard Centre, and it's still going. Wow. That is one of the few organisations. We have, I think, 5 workers employed at the moment, one asbestos organiser part, and we have general health and safety. So that's been going since 1987. And some of I'm one of the original people from that and from Merg. So it's amazing how we weren't a community group. We worked with and for trade unions, and we got small amounts of money from trade unions. But as I say, things like the Manpower Services Commission were very useful for getting funding. Yeah. So that was just an offshoot.
Just a very...
Oh, go on.
Sorry.
Go first.
Just to quickly mention that one of the offshoots of International Labour Reports is also still with us. The Global Labour Institute is based in Manchester and is still doing that kind of work of linking up workers in the UK with workers in many other countries.
Yeah, I'll stand up to say a few words. I hate having me back to people. So I'm Dave Carter. I worked at Merg. I also edited Ways and Means, the red book there. So I just want to talk about a sense of place, and which was the kind of students' union. And the students' union in the mid-70s, I was there from 73 to 76, and I was involved in the students' union throughout, with a very strong student community action group, a guy called Bob Oppenheimer, some people might remember. And so students were both very much welcomed because of the skills they brought, and absolutely despised because they were students. And by kind of balancing a way through that, some really good relationships were established between the student union. Out of the students' own self-interest, there was a big campaign to build a student union extension, because the student union was just much too small. Eventually that became the academy, and semi-commercially run, but it wasn't an extension. So a group of students occupied actually 3 buildings, the third one we haven't mentioned. They occupied the old music college, Diva Street, which became known as The Squat, but where, New Order played their first ever gig with, going undercover. Yeah, oh, right, yeah. And another group and part of that group occupied this empty building, 178 Waterloo Place. The rest of Waterloo Place, beautiful Georgian terrace, was occupied by an architect's and the Little McGill's bookshop. But both buildings were going to be demolished by the university for car parking. And that was a really valuable lesson. And unfortunately, some people forget about Waterloo Place. So Andy Spinoza, who's a good friend, and I do like his book, Manchester Unspun, but he says, there was just the squat, and this happened, and, all these things. It wasn't. The squat was for gigs and the sort of unofficial student union extension. But Waterloo Place, in this tiny part of the building, the Shanty Third World Centre, Music Force, Tosh Ryan, the Gay Centre. I mean, it was remarkable that became available. What we haven't mentioned is that, and this was mainly cordoned out this tiny Manchester anarchist group, the kind of group of anarchist students who believed in direct action. But another group of them occupied what is now the Pankhurst Centre. The original Pankhurst house was scheduled for demolition by the hospital for, you've guessed it, car parking. And this particular group of students, who are still connected with Manchester, they don't live in Manchester anymore, occupied the Pankhurst Centre and made a similar demand. How outrageous that Manchester in the 70s, was talking about its heritage, but, these buildings. And without that group of students, you wouldn't have had the squat and all the gigs that went on. You wouldn't have had Waterloo Place and all the organisations we're talking about.
Which we do have a copy of some of the organisations.
And you may not have had the Pankhurst Centre. So often that link between the Students' Union, which was also very opportunistic, and as Colin quite rightly said, it may not be the most working class place, but there was a sense of solidarity which was quite unusual. I worked for Student Community Action nationally, and there was really nothing quite like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. There were student community action groups everywhere, but they were mainly volunteering centres. In Manchester and Liverpool, Leeds, a lot of students were involved in the tenants campaign. There were actual tenants in these neighbourhoods. And that kind of provided a catalyst, I think, for many of the activities. And we mentioned late, great Dave Spooner, as my best friend died earlier this year of cancer. And part of the little group that's come together to produce a collective biography of Dave, but more importantly his legacy, is how the hell did it happen that a bunch of anarchists and big flamers from the University of Sussex and the University of Manchester were so involved in creating that catalyst? But I think it was because some of that happened post 79, but it was what happened in 70. I mean, the anti-apartheid campaign, the South African Liberation Society, SALS, was massive. There was more boycotting and occupation around solidarity with the South African struggle in Manchester than any other university outside of London. The Chile Solidarity campaign, the work that Colin did with, really dispossessed communities in parts of the world that you'd hardly heard of. That was a really heady mix together with the community politics, with the idealism of the sort of student mentality, which wasn't afraid to kick out at the university authorities. So this is just really fascinating, and may it continue. And it's great to be reunited with Caroline, who I haven't seen for 35 years or something. It's just behind me. Thanks.
There's a connection there with the Pankhurst Centre and the press. Because once the press moved out of Nella Jane Centre to just behind it, just behind the Warwick Cinema on Princess Road, you can see the address on some of these slides, 21A. And a fellow called Jim Wilson, who taught me how to print, he died not so long ago. He also, me and him, showed Lucy Fitzgerald and Andrew Cooper how to work the offset life out, and then it became the Women's Press, Women's Cooperative. And then it became Amazon Press. I think somehow they managed to locate to where Grassroots was. I might be wrong because it's downstairs on Newton Street. Really awkward. But you mentioned Big Flame. Neil, who was a Labour councillor, he'd been in Big Flame. He was councillor in North Manchester. Way after the press had closed, the press had been put, the actual machinery, the rotoprint machine, had been put in the Pankhurst Centre. How they got it in there, I don't know. I was off doing videos and playing in bands and things, I don't know. But Neil got in touch with me and Jim and said, I wanted to set up a paper in Harper A. This is like early 90s, I think, maybe a bit later. I was like, bloody hell, that press is still there in the Pankhurst Centre. Who knew? I don't think they ever used it. So we had to get this big truck. Neil organised it all. Me and just went along and watched. Well, they got this. The press was pretty big and heavy. Load it onto this low loader, and off it went to Colliers, to Harper A or somewhere. It might still be up there.
Yeah.
Who knows?
End of an era.
Well, yeah.
Just to give a shout out to Big Flame, there is a current exhibit up at the Working Class Movement
Yeah,
Library.
they were one of the few lefty groups who would.
Yeah, and they were very into newspapers too, so there's a great archive. Yeah.
I was just going to mention because it was 75A back Piccadilly where Amazon Press was, so near Grassroots, but not quite. One of the women from one of the women from the press, mainly when it was Amazon, wrote that article in the Northwest Labour History newsletter, news journal, and it's in the same issue. We've got the article about Grassroots books.
Yeah, you
which is
can actually see the intro was
yeah.
very dangerous.
Yeah. So I'm not sure whether you can get hold of that online. You can certainly get it from the Working Class Movement Library.
I think the archive here might have.
And they'll have it here, yes, certainly.
Yeah, Lucy's still going, but she's not going to get involved with this for some reason. She says it's all out there.
I mean, sometimes it's out there more than you know. There's lots of things, but there's a lot here. I think you had a question, Rory.
Well, just to add, I mean,
Sorry, I've got to count through.
Yeah. I mean,
Go, you go.
I'll just let them swap their phone numbers or whatever.
You don't go to the loo.
Well, good fun. Just to pick up a point on newsletters, and some of them weren't neighbourhood. So there's one by disabled people in Oldham, and it was the New Vale News, and it was run by Ian Stanton, and he was a printer before he had to have his legs amputated, and he sort of couldn't be working as a printer anymore, and he ended up in this social services day centre called New Vale House, run by Oldham Social Services, and he starts running with a Gestetner, a newsletter for Linda will know this story, for the centre. But of course, you know, he's a bit of an insurrectionist. So there's all kinds of scurrilous stuff in the newsletter about social services. And they ban him. Yeah. So he gets banned by social services because of what he's printed on their premises. But he then manages to get a job as the editor at the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. And again, he's producing a national magazine, essentially, very influential. And his archive is here. I mean, Linda, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
The Disabled People's Archive also has some of the New Vale newsletters as well. Yeah.
Because there's sometimes it's a movement that isn't of place. Yeah. Thank you.
were there any other comments or questions more broadly too? Questions are also welcome.
Could you say a bit about the time frame of your project so that we've some idea what people might be feeding into?
Well, so this started out as like a kind of a side project placement that we're supposed to be doing the summer with the Working Class Movement Library. But it's also something that I just am really interested in, care about. And this was a chance for me to learn about Manchester. So I still want to do that anyway. So yeah, for me, I'm particularly interested in this period of the 1970s. But I think as people were sharing here, there's so much that also goes over into the 80s, and there's so much changing in that time period. The Working Class Movement Library collection spans like everything. So there's no real parameters. My focus has tried to be on the 70s, but that's basically just to kind of make the scope a little bit more limited. So
Will you publish something publicly, or is it just the PhD?
So we've been doing blog posts and things like that. I think part of my interest in this project and part of this kind of collaboration also with other archives is like this question of, maybe how does Manchester kind of keep its history alive and in what ways? And I do feel like this would be a really amazing, perhaps local exhibit about Manchester history. I think these kinds of materials have such rich information that I would think kind of a younger generation would be really fascinated to see. So I think there's lots of potential for how to keep this type of thing going, but I think it's going to be beyond me. So I'll keep doing my little updates. But yeah, I think if it seems like it would be really great to have perhaps like an oral history at the Working Class Movement Library that could capture some of this, or if people had other ideas for how it connects, or how to get some of this knowledge or information even more accessible online, so more digitization, more things like that.
There's a punk exhibition upstairs here, so maybe that's something to aim for next year. Having some of this out in the central library upstairs so the public can see it.
And yeah, that is to say there's also, there's some amazing examples already around too. So but I think AIDS activism is up there, and I'm sure there's other ones upstairs too. Do you have anything to say? It's all right.
I was only going to say it's also worth bearing in mind the People's History Museum as well in Manchester. You know, for the artefacts, you know, Union banners and things like that. It's an amazing place as well. We've got so much in Manchester.
Yeah, it's true.
Thank you.
I believe they're not taking any more archival donations, but you might want to check that if that's something you're interested in doing.
Yeah, I guess that's another question. Like, we've had people just bring kind of a collection of things here tonight. So even to see what people might have in their closets or in their attics, and how that might be, again, there's lots in archives already, but in order to kind of connect it or fill in gaps, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I've spoken a lot, but I keep remembering things. The fact that Moss Side Press, when it started off, was based at the Arielle James Centre, was important. And some of you, a lot of you will know that the 1947 Pan-African Congress took place in Cheltenham Medlock Town Hall, which is now part of the uni. The facade is there, where you had really important speakers. It was a big event. And the legacy of that continued with Moss Side having a large black population, mainly West Indian, but quite a lot of Africans as well. Manchester's being a port, having a university, so you have Asian guys coming to study there, and some of them staying. Some stayed, had liaisons and buggered off. But that political tradition carried on. So you have people like Jack Clarke, who was a very strong activist, whose, I think, father was Ghanaian. They were active and inspired other people, especially Moss Side and Hume, where there were the various struggles to do with housing, to do with education and so on. Moss Side Press was luckily there, so we did a lot of printing for their campaigns, and there's been a recent exhibition at the Jack Clarke Centre about Kath's life. She died some time ago, and on the publicity for the exhibition there's a picture of a protest march with a large banner. I'm not sure what that protest was about, off the top of my head at the moment, but the banner behind it was for the Nazira Begum campaign to stop her being deported, Asian lady. And that was one of the first campaigns that the Film and Video Workshop got involved in. Greg Dropkin, American guy from New York, and myself got involved in that. So, through knowing Kath from being at the James Centre with the press, and then getting to know people like Gus John. You remember him? Yeah, he's still around. You know, there's a whole bunch of activists that we were fortunate enough to know socially. There'd be dances, benefit concerts or whatever. The West Indian Sports and Social Centre, Shabeens. You know. You had to have been there. But it was really important that the press was located there. And to an extent, when it moved to Prince's Road, those connections carried on. I mean, there were some rum tales. We had a quick one. We had a huge guillotine with a big wheel. right, with a blade that come down to cut the paper up. Yeah, used to get it in reams, A3 reams, but sometimes we'd have jobs there to cut it in half. And a guy came in, Caribbean guy came in one time with a suitcase and a £10 note, and he says, "Can you cut me some paper the same size as this £10 note?" I went, "Well, what's it for?" And she said, "We're having a competition, and the prize is a load of money." I think he said 10 grand, which I think it's a bit unlikely, this. We went, "Come on then, what's it worth?" And he pulled out a lump of Shirash. Right. We went, "Okay then." We cut it all up, and what the trick was, he had another real tenner, put them on the top of the paper. Right, so I presume it was some nefarious deal that was going on. But that wasn't unusual to get a request like that, so it was handy that we had this big guillotine. And with that, thank you and good night.
And just to say, there is an amazing local history exhibit up in the Cathlock Centre now, and it does have this really lovely display of community newspapers, many from the 70s and 80s and ongoing, and then also, so again, you can see Maasai News, you can see Maasai People's Papers. And they have, the tables have kind of various neighborhood history, and there's an exhibit up on the walls too. So this is an amazing example, I think, of...
Is that still up?
Yeah, it's still up. It might even be permanent. I'm not actually sure. Yeah, okay, that's good. So it is really amazing, and it has a lot about kind of like housing activism and kind of issues around urban... renewal, but then also kind of later history as well. So definitely a center for lots of things happening. Not sure how we're doing for time. I guess if anyone had any last questions or comments, we can also,
I was just curious if children were publishing in some of these community papers something, not just pages for children, but if children had something to say, and then you published it and printed it.
Well, I also had a children's issue that was notorious. It's a bit different. With a very, I don't think you know Rupert the Bear. It was a comic strip, and I think the Daily Express or the Daily Mail.
Okay.
They did an issue edited by teenagers and young people with a very rude picture of Rupert the Bear, and that got into trouble locally. The Longsight paper had a kids page. I don't know if children were involved in that or not. I really don't know. I don't remember printing anything made by kids anyway. Good question.
I mean, I think it's interesting in terms of like example like Longside News, like there's things like the adventure playgrounds and the play schemes, and like it feels like children are very present and in that mix, but I don't know if they wrote anything.
No, I'm sorry to say, I don't think we ever thought of that.
There was the Manchester Free School as well, which is mentioned in a special edition in Manchester by Peace News.
Ladies and gentlemen, the time just coming up to 7:45, and the library is closing at 8 o'clock.
Sorry, no. Just to say, if there is some materials here, so if you want to take a look on your way out, and there's some really interesting examples. That one was shared tonight, where you have bigger publications like Peace News that do a special issue about Manchester. So looking through this, there's so many kind of highlights and things that it brings together a lot. So, many of which we mentioned. So I'll put this out here too.
You didn't know that.